In Germany, every household has to pay €18.36 every month to help finance the public broadcasters. It doesn't matter whether you actually watch any of the TV channels or listen to any of the radio channels. If you're resident in Germany, you or someone you live with has to pay. I guess it won't surprise you to learn that not everybody is particularly happy about this. Nobody wants to be forced against their will to pay the government to beam propaganda straight into their homes. So, what's the history behind it? And is it really a way to just indoctrinate the people? Spoiler alert, it's not a way to indoctrinate the people. And it's a particular issue in the modern age when you also have to subscribe to about half a dozen streaming services just to keep up with your favourite TV shows. Want to watch Wednesday? That's on Netflix. How about Tulsa King? That's Paramount Plus. Or Severance? Yeah, that's over on Apple TV. But at least with those services, if you're not actually watching their content, you don't have to pay for a subscription. The German broadcasting contribution is mandatory. Not that Germany is the only country with something like this. For example, in the UK, if you have a television or if you want to access the traditional broadcasters' media players, you have to have a TV license. And there are similar schemes in many other countries as well, like Japan or South Africa. This kind of compulsory charge seems quite anachronistic, so presumably the reason we have it has to do with history. And indeed it does, a history going back over 100 years to the early 1920s. In those days, radio was a brand new technology. People sitting at home could listen live to speeches, concerts and lectures. They could even get up-to-the-date news without having to wait for the newspaper the next morning. Over in the UK, although the first experimental broadcasts got the public excited, the government worried that they could, if left unregulated, start to interfere with military communications. And so it was decided that only one company should be given a broadcast license. It was initially called the British Broadcasting Company and was created by a consortium of the major manufacturers of radio receivers. The company was to be financed by a small charge on the sale of each radio receiver. The problem, as it turned out, was that people were either buying their radio sets from other companies or even making their own. It was very easy to make a simple radio with just a handful of components, and as long as you had a good signal, you could listen to any broadcast. So the BBC found itself losing money, and it was banned from advertising, so it couldn't hope to get any ad revenue. The following year, a solution was found. Everybody who owned a radio receiver, regardless of who actually made it, would be required to buy a license. In that year, the first German radio station started broadcasting, and within seconds it was already warning listeners that they would need a license to be allowed to hear it.
Achtung, Achtung! Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin, im Boxhaus.
Auf Welle 400 Meter. Meine Damen und Herren, wir machen Ihnen davon Mitteilung, dass am heutigen Tage der Unterhaltungsrundfunkdienst mit Verbreitung von Musikvorführungen auf drahtlos telefonischem Wege beginnt. Die Benutzung ist genehmigungspflichtig.
This was, by the way, the end of October 1923, which was during the final days of the period of hyperinflation that had crippled the German economy. The license fee was initially set at 25 marks a year, but by January it had increased to 60, which at the time represented about 1/3 of the average monthly wage. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent today of almost €140 a month. Not surprisingly, not a lot of people actually paid for it, leading to impassioned pleas from a government minister, increased penalties for anyone caught listening to the radio illegally, and an amnesty for anyone voluntarily purchasing a license. What eventually worked was reducing the license fee to just 2 marks a month. Well, I say it worked. Still, way more radio sets were being sold than licenses. But even though evasion continued to be a problem, the basic idea remained in place. right through the Second World War and beyond. Both West and East Germany had radio licenses, but in the 1950s, television came along. The basic radio license remained, but in both countries, if you had a television set, you had to pay for a more expensive license that also allowed you to receive TV broadcasts. It's important to point out that this was not a tax, it was a licensing fee. When you pay a tax, the money goes to government to fund all the things that a government might need or want to do. In the case of a radio or TV license, you are buying permission to do something, but the revenue from that doesn't go into the same pot as tax revenue. And that model was kept for a reason. Even though public broadcasters are basically administered by the government, they must not be subject to any kind of political interference. They are not mouthpieces for the government and must be allowed the freedom of speech to be able to criticize it. Financing these broadcasters with tax money might have given too much control to the government. So instead, the broadcasters themselves created an organization called the Gebühreneinzugszentrale, which was responsible for issuing licenses, collecting the fees, and then passing them on to the broadcasters without getting the government involved. And in this way, the public broadcasters were financed. At the moment, there are 9 regional broadcasters with various local TV and radio stations, 2 national TV broadcasters and 1 national radio broadcaster. Well, as I edit this, I realize that I really made a mess of this explanation, so let me set the record straight. The ARD isn't actually a broadcaster in its own right, but an association of the regional broadcasters. These all make their own content for regional audiences, but also contribute to a channel that broadcasts nationally and uses the ARD logo. To the average viewer watching traditional broadcast TV, it looks as if ARD and ZDF are the 2 national channels with a 3rd channel for local programming, but in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. Also, I didn't mention Deutsche Welle, which is also a public broadcaster, but because it's not for domestic broadcast, it is paid for by taxes and not contributions. These stations are very heavily restricted on the amount of advertising they're allowed to carry. It's not zero like the BBC, but it is very little. For a few decades, these were the only broadcasters, but in the 1980s, the German airwaves were opened up to private broadcasters. These gave German audiences more choice, a faster, flashier look, and just generally a more stimulating viewing experience. But they also gave them tons of annoying adverts and overly sensationalized news reporting. While the public broadcasters were starting to look tired and dated, private broadcasters were seen as cheap and trashy. Apart from that, things stayed mostly the same for the rest of the century. But then, the next revolution in communications technology arrived, the information superhighway, today more commonly known as the Internet. As broadcasters started to offer content over the Internet, did this mean that every computer hooked up to the Internet was now a receiver that needed to be licensed? A television set in those days had only one purpose: to receive and decode television broadcast signals. A computer, on the other hand, was usually used for completely different things, like writing articles, calculating your quarterly finances, or sending emails. Initially, computers were exempt from the requirement to be licensed, but that exemption ended in 2006. And it wasn't just computers. Mobile phones that could connect to the Internet were already available, and they also had to be licensed. It soon became clear that a different approach was needed, and in 2013 the license was finally abolished and replaced by a simple flat rate charged to every household in the country. This was really irksome for all those families who previously hadn't had to pay anything, but for everyone else, at least it simplified a lot of things. But since this doesn't pay for a license anymore, it's just a sum of money that everybody has to pay, it is no longer a fee, but a contribution. And the organization collecting it is now called the Beitragsservice, although you will still hear Germans calling it by its old abbreviation. It's also not a tax. Any government could increase or decrease taxes as they see fit, but the broadcasting contribution is set at a specific amount regulated by a treaty between all 16 states. In theory, this should help to insulate it from political interference. But why not just abandon public broadcasters entirely? Just privatize the lot of them and let market forces take care of everything. Well, probably one of the most valuable things in any democracy is high-quality journalism. You need solid facts and analysis if you want to have any chance of being able to judge for yourself who you should vote for at the next election. The public broadcasters' news bulletins and current affairs programs may seem sterile and colourless, but they do have one big advantage. Because these broadcasters are not trying to compete for clicks or ad revenue, and they're not trying to please their shareholders, they're less likely to be sensationalist and more likely to be objective. And this is especially true with today's social media. Content creators can get way more clicks by making people feel angry or shocked. It's nice to have a service run by professionals who still value facts over emotion. But are they truly independent and completely free of bias? Well, probably not. No human being is. But they are set up in a way that should, if everything works as designed, help to ensure that they can remain as objective as humanly possible. Thank you, esteemed viewers, for watching this video. If you would like to see another video, please click on the thumbnail you should see on screen now. Good night.